Hi, this is development log 11 for MegaSplat, I believe. Maybe it's 12, I'm not sure. I'm going to show you some stuff that I've been working on. So the first thing was it turned out that some of the light mapping modes weren't working for tessellation shaders. So I managed to get those all working. So here we are with Directional Specular on a low-res bake because it takes forever to do a high-res one. But it's all working with MegaSplat and tessellation all working together. And this is actually nice because it forced me to dig through some more of the Unity lighting code, and I actually found an earlier entry point into their code so that I can use more of their code rather than having to match up the math with theirs. So that's always good because it means that things will match more closely and there's less chance of error. So the other thing that I wanted to show off is a newer feature. Let me go to my examples folder. Oh, I added a example of a Amplify shader editor. This is a single layer MegaSplat shader, essentially done in Amplify. So that's now in the folder. They had changed some code which broke some stuff, so I worked it out with them, and they have, in their latest beta, have fixed some things that allow us to work again. They're in beta as well, so we're both developing our products fast, and sometimes things break. So let me go to the mesh tessellation scene now. Not worry about the baked one. So the new feature that I want to talk about is snow. So basically what we have is we have a global snow system. The basic idea is that you can have snow animated in and out of the scene, have it accumulate, and it interacts with all the surfaces in a plausible way. So before I show off the parameters, I'll actually show off the effect here. I have a little component here with an animation on it. Basically, it's just a list of key values and then a time slider. And so you actually want to animate the values differently depending on whether you're accumulating snow or whether it's going away. And so what I have here is that as I scrub this slider, you'll see the snow comes into the scene, and then it sort of builds up, and it almost covers over those puddles. But then as we get to here, you'll see that it starts to not only the snow not only begins to harden, you'll see how it's sort of becoming this crystalline look here, but the actual tessellation is being modified with the snow, and then things start poking out from the snow based on their height as the snow dissipates away. And a really subtle effect too is that the surface actually around the snow gets a little bit wet. It's a little hard to pick up, especially in a video, but when you're up close, it looks really kind of nice. And then the other subtle effect is really this, the crystal formations of ice forming in the snow versus the more fluffy snow here. So you get that difference there. I still have some one minor issue, which you may have noticed here, which I have to work out, which is that on certain modes, the shadow biasing in Unity 5.4 can sort of become a problem. Now in 5.5, they've switched the Z buffer around. I have not done the test in 5.5 yet. I'm thinking that these artifacts might go away in 5.5, but if not, then what I'm probably going to do is add some small biasing value to make sure that these are always under the snow in the shadow pass. So yeah, so that's basically the animated snow. The little example here. I keep this off in the scene because otherwise you can't change the snow values. But here, let me put it to snow, and I'll start showing you some of those parameters. So if we select our material, right now you have a single value on the compiler, which is global snow. Another thing I added to the puddles section is this idea that puddles push terrain down. Okay, so that was the way I originally shipped it. And what would happen is when you paint the puddles, all the rocks would get pushed down and the water would be revealed. And that makes sense from sort of a painting dynamic when you have a big flat surface and you want to push the terrain down to expose the water that's, below grade or whatever. But if you're going to animate the creation of water on your terrain, for instance, if you want to have streams form and things like that, you don't want it to change the terrain. Instead, what you want is that the water comes up from below and fills in the cracks. So if you set push terrain down to true, you will get the old behavior, and if you leave it off, then you'll get the new behavior, which is basically that the water will come up from the terrain. So depending on what you're doing with it, they're actually both useful for sort of different effects. So let's get into the actual snow parameters themselves. So if you go down to your actual shader, you'll see you have a diffuse map and a normal map. And the diffuse map expects to have a height value, and the normal map is always in SAO format. And that is, it basically shows one packing format because there's not really a whole lot of reason to have another one. And this gives you your smoothness and ambient occlusion value for the snow. You have a UV scale, just like you have for any other thing. You have this amount slider. This controls the overall amount of the snow. There's a height range, which controls the area of the snow from a vertical perspective. So basically, if you only want it to appear, up in the hills, you can move up the minimum sort of value for that, and then it'll start higher up. And then this is the blend width, basically for how quickly it changes from the beginning to the end. So if I put it really low, you can see that there's not really any blend whatsoever. It just sort of stops. But as you raise the blend, oops, that's a height map influence. As you raise the blend amount higher, you're going to get a more varied snow. And this is going to depend on these other settings. So as I change my height map influence, it's going to control how much of the height map is taken into account there. And so with these parameters, you can control, so like the height map influence here, you can see I get a wider blend because the bumps and the rocks are pushing through the snow. Now there's another parameter on here called erosion. And erosion is essentially, it's similar to the height map influence, but it operates a little bit differently. And so what it does is cause things that are higher in the height map to basically come out first from the snow. So basically, as you animate the erosion up, you'll see that snow sort of melts off the top of things first. And so when you're animating the snow, this has a lot of effect on how it looks in terms of how it melts. Now, there's also the question of the snow's specular response itself. When you're at 0, you're going to get a very fluffy type of snow. But as you change this, I call it a crystal value, but maybe it's iciness. As you move that up or down, you're going to get a much different specular response where it looks more like it's hardened and icy. If you go too high, it gets kind of crazy, right? You get into this, I don't even know what that is. But I let the values go free, though, because there's some things you might like going negative here really produces a very different look than when you go up here in the positive. And so depending on what type of look you're looking for the snow, you can actually get some interesting values there. Just going to set it for 0.5 for now. And then the final one is the melt. And what the melt affects is if we go somewhere where the snow is near the rock here, as you increase melt, what will happen is the area around the snow will get wetter looking. So you can see when we're up really high here, this all looks very wet. And so there's sort of a really subtle range here. I think I left the range at 0 to 0.6, yeah, which is enough to get it to look almost broken when you go up to 0.6. But somewhere around 0.4 or so is where you get that sort of like, wetter but not totally wet kind of look. So one thing I did was integrate this with the puddles. So you can see I have some puddles painted here. Now one thing that's really nice is that there's this kind of really nice interaction that can happen between the two. So if I could switch open up my vertex painter here. And let's see, dock that here. And then I'm going to go ahead and activate this and select my brush so I have it. And I'm going to make my side go a little wider. So on the terrain painter, there's a puddles tab. I'm on mesh right now. But for meshes, you have to paint into the UV channels directly. And so UV3Y is going to control the amount of puddles. So I can set this brush value here, which will sort of cap out the brush so that it never goes higher than this. And then I can just paint more or less water in this area. And again, this is all flow mapped, so I can come in here and use the flow tab, painting on the right channels to control the direction of the flow. Now what you'll notice is that it tends to, if I put this on really light, like 0.2 is my maximum value when I paint, you'll see how it dampens the snow a bit, and then it sort of just melts it a little bit. And as I raise this up, it's going to melt it a little more, and you actually get this cracked melting going on based on the height map. And again, if you use the erosion on the snow, this can even be further enhanced with the erosion and wetness. So you can actually melt the snow before you actually bring in the water using this feature. And as I increase this, you'll start to get the water flows. But what's nice about this is that it's plausibly realistic, right? In that areas around where the water is flowing have more of the ground texture showing up, and the snow tends to melt off quicker. And one of the things that really affects that is the blend on the puddles. So the sharper your blend is, the more this is just going to be snow or water, right? With you can see the rocks underneath the water here. They're actually showing through, and they're not covered in snow because they're under the water. But as you move the blend factor down, you get actually to the point where if the blend factor is really low, then this acts more as a way to melt and clear snow than it acts as a way to actually create puddles, which is really interesting. So now as I paint here, you can see I'm just melting in general. And even if I paint a higher value, so let's do 0.8 as my top, you can see that it's really just acting as a melt. And again, because of the way I have my, you see the terrain moving here because of the way I have my puddle set. But the nice thing about this is that, again, you can use your puddles as a way to melt things, or you can use them for actual puddles. And you can also, because again, all these parameters are animatable, if I come in here and I slowly bring up the blend on the puddles, and I would have to do this really slowly because the values are so touchy. So if I'm actually doing it, typing in these values really slowly here, you can see the difference between like 1 and 0.1 or 1 and 2. You can see how it's slowly getting wetter, and the puddles are starting to form and blend in here. So this is really pretty powerful for dynamic stuff, because what you can do is actually use the dynamic runtime painting to sort of paint in the water flows. You could even use the spheres that we drop on the demo here. You could have them adjusting this, and you could actually have them forming rivers based on the physics of how that sphere moves. You obviously wouldn't show the sphere. And you could have it actually melt away the snow in those areas, and then sort of slowly bring in the water until this thing looks, damp and sort of full of actual flow. And so if I can get my inspector back here, because somehow it flipped away. Oh, great. Here we go. So, so basically, as I raise up that mesh, this guy. Also, the interpolation contrast. I don't know if this is a thing, but I always notice mine seems to get slammed to 0.9, and I'm wondering if I have some kind of bug in there. If you guys are seeing that, let me know on the forums, because maybe there's something I need to look into. But I notice every time I come back, this thing seems to be at 0.9999. So I think there's something going on there. So where were we? The amount of the blend factor on the puddles. So yeah, I can use that to also control sort of how much of those puddles are visible at any given time. And let me turn on my animation again, because it always turns off. And then I can play with all of these snow parameters as well. Another thing I added to the puddles was a porosity control. And so this lets you control effectively like how. So before I had essentially two BDRFs for the puddles, one which was considered a clean one and one which was a dirty. And I found that I could get a better response by just messing with the porosity. And so this, technically what this simulates is that different surfaces, based on how porous they are, when they get wet, they get darker or lighter. So a surface which is highly porous will, the water will soak into that and it'll stay dark and wet looking much, longer because it has more moisture in it. Whereas a surface which is very smooth tends not to do that. So right now there's just a porosity value for the global water. And so what this lets you do is sort of globally adjust the porosity of every texture. But what it really ends up doing is sort of lightening and darkening the water. So you can set this to 0.4 for Sebastian Lagarde's traditional puddle, values. But I've exposed it so that you can actually adjust that a bit. What might be interesting in the future is having per pixel porosity maps for the terrain. I'm not in a rush to put that in just because it's another texture that would have to be sampled for everything. So I think it's a very high-end feature. What was that game? Naughty Dog used that in one of their games to great effect when they were doing wet caves and things like that. So it's definitely a possibility. I think also a porosity value per surface might be another way to do it as a per text property. So that's basically the snow system and how that interacts with puddles and tessellation and all of that. The snow is fairly cheap compared to things like tessellation, which are very expensive, or triplanar texturing, or even flow mapping. So both the puddles takes two texture samples on one texture to do the flow-based puddles, and then the snow takes 2 samples per pixel. So it's relatively cheap compared to other shader effects. And so what I've sort of stumbled upon here is that we have a high-end multi-material system in flow mapping for doing lavas and all kinds of other stuff. And then puddles and snow have effectively become cheaper global systems that you can use for this, at least in the case of puddles, for similar effects. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm just going to new up a scene to do it, is some internal tools that I am currently not shipping. I would if people found them useful. But in my version, what I have is this shader compile tester. And so what this thing does is it basically, if you look at one of these shaders and you really look at all of these options, okay, there are a lot of options here, and anybody could set any combination of these options, and it will actually compile a different shader. So for ages, I've been doing this by hand, where I go in, and when I change something, I sort of take a guess at what code could be affected, and I go flick on and off different settings and change different values in here, and let it produce all these different shaders and see if I have any errors that are introduced. Well, the last update, an error got through that broke the standard Puddles mode, not the flow one, but the Puddles mode, because I didn't happen to check that one. And so, when something becomes this complex, it becomes time-consuming one and a problem because I can easily forget something. So basically what I did was I wrote this shader compiler tester, and what this will do is it will compile, the naive implementation of it just compiled every shader possible. The problem with that is that as I started to put all these parameters in, and I haven't even put them all in yet, there were over 200,000 shaders compiling, and it can do, my laptop anyway, can do about 8,000 shaders a night while I sleep. So that would take an incredibly long time to process, and you could farm it out, to multiple machines if I had those, but it's an insane number of shaders. And the reality is that, many of these things are either going to work or they're not. So for instance, the detail noise texture. It doesn't matter what packing mode I'm in or whether I'm tessellation or not. That is just going to work because it's just a piece of code at the end that runs in all of those modes if it's on. So instead, what I've done now is go through all of these options and try to come up with a minimal set of things that need to be tested. And so when I click this, it basically will go through all the combinatorics that could be created, the 200,000 shaders, and strip out, a small number that are the most likely to find bugs. And then eventually I'll have a mode that runs overnight that does a deeper dive. It still won't be 100% coverage, but it'll hopefully be 100% of what I consider to be reasonable coverage of tests, right? So it'll catch the most common errors and test all the pathways in the ways that they actually get used, not the theoretical ways that things might be possible to break. So hopefully that will keep it fast enough that I can run a full regression set test on all of these shaders before every release and catch bugs before they happen, and also fast enough that I can run something like this minimal test after I've made a bunch of changes when I want to go get some food or something like that, and catch more bugs and prevent things from breaking. The rest of this release is mostly bug fixes. There was a lot of changes to try to make the terrain painter a little more tolerant when things are not set up correctly on the materials. Some stuff for third parties. We've had some third party tools, voxel engines and such, which have started integrating MegaSplat, which is amazing. It's always fun to see what people do with your tools, and just general cleanup type stuff. So hopefully this has been interesting and you're enjoying the product, and I will talk to you soon when I have some more stuff to show off. Thank you.